and ethics that really get into issues around explicit and implicit bias considerations. Additionally, they'll be looking at wellness management, cultural diversity, gang awareness, hate crimes, terrorism, and mental health and crisis interventions. One thing that Megan Poulos, who is a legislative liaison and public information officer, said is they are looking for subject matter experts as they are fundamental to revising these learning domains. So I think I'll stop there. Certainly there are a lot of opportunities for individuals who are subject matter experts to provide feedback. And I know that on their website, and perhaps we can share it here in the chat, people can sign up to apply to be subject matter experts. I believe those meetings will be held on the 13th and 14th of September. Actually, one last thing I do want to just mention briefly is federal legislation has mandated a 988 number that runs contemporaneously with 911, and it's really to address mental health crises that individuals may have, especially addressing what might be or providing prevention in terms of suicide and suicide ideation. So I will stop there and take any questions if folks may have them.
Manju, any questions for this committee? Thank you. Hearing none, I'll just move along to the Stop Data Analysis Subcommittee.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So the Stop Data Analysis Subcommittee met on July 21st. We conducted some initial business, approving minutes. The crux of our meeting was devoted to discussing CGIS's analysis of data for the 2022 report. We focused on three things: contextual stops, the stops of youth, and then also we discussed issues pertaining to data quality and other issues pertaining to research, specification choices that the research team has to make in conducting the contextual stop analysis. So in our discussion of pretext stops, we looked at various different types of violation types and the incidents and saw some preliminary results. So bicycle violations, jaywalking, consent-only searches, in terms of bicycles, and then also we looked at discussed some initial results pertaining to loitering stops. In terms of bicycle stops and jaywalking stops, in both instances, they sort of account for a relatively small proportion of the stops reported in the RIPA data. But there are some race disparities when looking at the share of stops that are accounted for by those categories that, with African Americans over, having a higher proportion of their stops that were for bikes and jaywalkings. For loitering stops, what the initial analysis was showing is that there was a relatively high incidence or a high proportion of stops for transgender, that people were identified as transgender, and then also for people who identified as having a disability, and particularly people that had a mental health disability. There was a pretty lengthy discussion of moving and violations, so there is, I believe, a question on the written form that allows officers to check whether the infraction is a moving or non-moving violation. And I think there's three possibilities: moving equipment and non-moving equipment, such as expired registration tags. The RIPA staff, in particular Kevin Walker, had tried to look at the actual vehicle codes of the violations associated with these different categories, and found that there were many instances where a particular infraction or violation would be classified as moving and sometimes would be classified as non-moving. Although they generally, there's a correspondence. Things like speeding was disproportionately moving, and using and equipment violations were increasingly non-moving, but sometimes they weren't, right? And it was sort of tried to brainstorm through why that might be, and essentially what was driving that sort of inconsistency. So we had a pretty lengthy discussion of some proposed definitions that CGIS was going to use to distinguish between a moving and a non-moving violation. That was solely for their purposes of taking the vehicle code violations and creating a sort of rubric by which they were going to define some as moving, some as non-moving, and some as non-moving equipment, including registration. And that was primarily for their research purposes. And so there'll be likely be another variable that rests on that crosswalk that they're going to develop and then use going forward. We saw some initial results of youth stops. Kevin Walker had presented some findings pertaining to stops that were made by school resource officers, as well as stops that were made on school premises. There are a couple of interesting patterns there, and some of which being that school resource officers often make stops that don't happen on campus, and that many stops that are on campus are not always made by school resource officers. So we spent a little time digging into that. And then in terms of data quality, so at every stop data analysis meeting we have kind of a running discussion about consistency checks and situations where inconsistencies arise. Back in our March meeting, we had a pretty lengthy discussion of the issues pertaining to how lethal uses of force are being marked on RIPA and how they appear to be inconsistent relative to other forms where firearm discharges are recorded. The new regs might fix that by separating use of force from other actions taken during stops. DOJ presented some ideas for other types of comparisons they would do that, in addition to looking at external data sources to look for consistency, which is, if anyone read the report that board member Ochoa sent around, we know that's an important source of data quality checking, at least for the LA Sheriff Department. But they're also trying to come up with ways that they can internally look for consistency. So, in situations where somebody's arrested and it began with a traffic stop, we should see that someone was asked to exit a vehicle or was forcibly removed from the vehicle in order for the person to be arrested. And so there are internal checks that DOJ can do. There was some discussion also from attending board members to perhaps add to the standard analysis some assessment of the duration of stops, how long they're taking, and how that varies with the type of stop and the characteristics of the members of the public that are involved in the stop. And that's it.
Steve, I know on the agenda it says report back from subcommittee co-chairs and Department of Justice staff. Is there someone from DOJ who's going to present on anything on this?
I don't think so. Is Nancy and Allison, is maybe Kevin, if he's here in the event that there are questions?
Yes. So we weren't. Sorry, my video is on. We put that in the event that the board had questions and someone from the research center needed to answer them, but we don't have a presentation at this time.
Great, thank you. Are there questions on this? Or if other board members don't have any, I have a few concerns that I want to make sure we discuss on this. First, I think the data, there's a couple different issues about data collection data collection that can arise. One that I don't think we've spent enough time on is the data coming in from the departments, just missing stops, missing actions, and really being something that can't be handled in the data center by checking with other sources or, doing other ways that the data center has really tried to make sure that the data has sufficient integrity. The trends may be accurate that we're reporting back in these reports, but I think it's obscuring the severity based on what we've seen in jurisdictions that have taken a deeper dive in looking at the data. I circulated the LASD audit. I had previously circulated, I think, the LAPD audit like 2 years ago. And just to give some examples from that for folks who haven't had a chance to look, the LASD Inspector General looked at the LA Sheriff's Department data and compared it to other data sources that they had, and noted that there are at over 50,000 self-initiated stops during this period that were not captured in the RIPA data, that were not reported to RIPA, 50,000 stops. Deputies failed to report over 18,000 consent searches, which if that had been reported would have doubled the number of consent searches that the agency had taken. They failed to report over 25,000, which would have been 37% of the backseat detentions that the agency conducted. And they reported only 33,000 arrests, while the IG found the LASD's internal records reflected 3 times that amount. So they had nearly 108,000 arrests. They reported 33,000 to RIPA. As a reminder, we'll also look at the use of force data. Just for one incident, based on work that I was doing, not part of the OIG's analysis, but LASD for 2019 reported 3 shootings, 2 of which were for white civilians. LASD actually reported 31 shootings to the DOJ that year. And looking at other data sources, the majority of folks were Latina from that population. The LAPD audit showed, which they did a video audit, so looking at video cam data and comparing that to what the officers filled out for that same stop, and found that 23% of people searched didn't have that search documented in RIPA, which was either because the stop itself wasn't in there, meaning they didn't even note that they had stopped the person, or the search wasn't included. And this is already a significant issue, but this is also much more of an issue with respect to obscuring what's happening with people of color. So for instance, in the LASD report, I think they found that stops of Latina people were the most underreported. 66% of the underreported data was related to Latina folks. And I was speaking of this when I was looking at the NLSLA presentation, which found that Latina folks were stopped a little bit less than would have been expected based on their population. Now, if you have, 50,000 stops that aren't being detected, how is that going to affect that data? Is that going to actually show that they're being stopped at much greater rates than you would have expected? So it has definitely a significant impact on the data that we're looking at. And even in the LAPD data, while they didn't look specifically at, they didn't report back specifically the difference in race for folks who were not reported and reported, but it was more common for stops where there was alleged gang affiliation, and we know what that kind of is euphemism for. And so for gang-related stops, there were 9% of people stops were missing, so they didn't even note that they had stopped a person, and then 26% of the activities were missing, versus in the larger universe, about 5% of stops were missing of the people completely, and 18% of overall actions were missing. And so that's important. That's a big deal, right? We're making conclusions about these actions that are being taken, how common pretextual stops are, use of forces, how are they arising out of these stops. And I think while, again, the overall trends may be accurate, this is really obscuring how much certain communities are being impacted by this. And not just in the context of our reports, this data being inaccurate is going to have significant impacts on actually people's lives, because this is the basis for litigation, this is the basis for policy change, this is the basis for all kinds of interventions. And most particularly, this data is significant to the implementation of the Racial Justice Act, which provided a way for folks who experience bias in the prosecution of crimes to challenge that bias to get different outcomes, including getting more severe penalties eliminated, charges dropped. And ironically, one case that has come out regarding the use of this data in that context, they relied on statewide data to support reversal of, or to support getting discovery into the agency's, the prosecutor's potential racial bias, and the AG argued against reliance on the statewide data and said it needed to be focused on more local data. And I think if the AG is going to be arguing that they should be relying on this data, then they need to be taking more affirmative steps to make sure this data is correct. Even for LASD, the sheriff specifically told RIPA that it had conducted audits and had posted them online of this data. And those audits, there's no record of those audits occurring, and LASD has specifically told their inspector general that audits are impossible given the way that the data is set up. So not only do we have people not complying with their legal requirements under the law, they're also misrepresenting their compliance as well. So I think at the minimum, I think when we're talking about our reports, we need to be caveating this, I think, at the outset, that there's this acknowledgement of, missing data and the direction which this missing data probably directs, right? That's not just the data is randomly missing. It's missing in a way that suggests that there's more of certain things happening than is reported. And I also think the DOJ needs to take action in this context. Before I was even on the board, that I was raising this as an issue, and the DOJ responded that they could engage, investigate, do whatever kind of engagement is appropriate if there was an indication that officers were not complying with their responsibilities under RIPA. I think we have sufficient evidence of that, at least with these agencies that have taken a deep dive, but also I think by looking more closely at the data, I think the DOJ could uncover more. I think this is going to be a bigger issue as we get smaller agencies reporting, where these missing data is going to have a much more significant impact. So that was a lot, but I think it was important to really highlight, for folks who haven't had a chance to look at the reports, the significance of this missing data issue from the police departments. That's not something that can really be fixed on the back end.
Can I offer some thoughts? I did look at the report, and I wonder maybe if DOJ knows how many different departments actually have two separate systems like LASD and have to, where the officers are clearing the calls in CAD and entering information required and then going to a separate system to sort of fill the RIPA data in. Because that seems to, at least just from reading the report and the analysis of their inspector general, it seemed to be, fairly consistent early on, and then the undercount seemed to grow with time. And there was a certain degree where the CAD data was not speaking at all. They were entirely separable from the RIPA collection effort. And I wonder if that's generally what's happening across the departments, or are there some departments that have integrated systems where fields can be automatically populated and they don't have to duplicate efforts?
In response to your question, I can, this is Erin Choi, I can chime in just to say that we have some high-level information about how they are transmitting the data to us, but not, I wouldn't say, hard statistics about whether or not within the agency they're doing duplicate entry, like entry into a CAD and then entry into a standalone system just for RIPA. There are some systems, just based on work with the agencies, I know that there are some that are integrated that, like let's say a module has been added to that CAD system to capture the RIPA information and forward it to DOJ, so that there is some, to some degree, integration. But I would also just put a caveat that could vary even within an agency. Not necessarily all of the officers, would be operating from a patrol car. So even within a particular agency, it may of how the data is getting captured depending on the type of work that the officer is doing and what equipment is available to them.
Lawanda, do you have a question? Want to jump in?
Rich has
I
a
think you might
question.
still be muted, Lawanda. We're not hearing you. Lawanda, we still aren't hearing you. I don't know if you can hear me, but we aren't hearing you. We still aren't hearing you. I don't know if it's possible to maybe rejoin, and we'll go on and come back. Okay. I saw Rich. You had your hand up too. If you want to make a comment.
Thank you, Melanie. I'm glad you brought this to everyone's attention, and I'm not glorifying or sticking up for LASD at all. But as I talked about in our last subcommittee meeting, I encourage all board members on this call to go on ride-alongs and watch a RIPA entry. Okay, it's a learning experience. It's a learning curve. So I'm asking everyone to do that. I've ridden already with over 15 agencies and watched them do a RIPA. I want to get educated myself because I have to do them myself right now up until last week. And I just want you guys to just see, I'm not glorifying what's happening with LASO, please. It's not all cops are bad, and not all cops are purposely avoiding the RIPA entries to be discussed here at the board. Okay, but aside from being in a patrol car, I'm glad someone's talked about that earlier, is yeah, you're in a patrol car and yeah, you need to pull over and you need that 20 minutes to enter that data. And I take great pride with that. And sometimes when my computer freezes, I have to go to the station to do it. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I'm starting to see some additional resistance towards law enforcement that we're purposely hiding, and that's not the intent whatsoever. It's a learning curve for several agencies. I was in the last tier, so my agency's smaller. But I have heard that issue as I start to talk to different agencies of different cops in different counties, whether they're deputies or police officers, of what their concerns are. And yeah, everyone wants to provide that data and follow the law. I just wanted to throw that out there. I would not be doing peace officers justice, let alone this board. And I encourage everyone to go out and do that. Come on, ride with me. I'd be more than welcome to just show you.
Lawanda, I see you're back now. Did you want to try to jump in?
Yes, can you hear me now? Thank you. I'm very concerned if the data that we receive from two of the biggest agencies in the state is inaccurate. I'm concerned about all the data because it makes you question it all. If they're not giving us all the stops, then there's a problem. And what is the repercussion when they don't do it? There has to be some, because if there's no repercussion from them not giving accurate information, they're not going to give it. We're going to be in a very, very bad situation. They're going to determine what we receive and what we don't receive then. And to hear that big number, 30% coming from the sheriff, that's huge. That is huge, especially down here in LA County.
Thank you both. Did anyone else? Oh, Andrea.
Yeah, I take to heart what everyone has said, and Board Member Ochoa, I think you laid bare some of the ongoing concerns, which are not limited to Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, right? And they reach into other departments as well. And I think what is ringing the alarm bell is that the data that is being provided through RIPA is inconsistent with the data that is being provided to other government agencies. And so it raises the question about, why that is, and whether it's something that can be corrected, whether it's intentional, whether it's what is the gap there that needs to close. And it goes to, as I said earlier, it goes to the issue of accountability. which is really important, right? There are always going to be ways to improve and streamline the way this data is collected and so forth. But I think the accountability piece is really important to make sure that people understand the imperative of collecting this and comply with the requirements laid out in the law.
Thank you, Manju.
I just want to piggyback on what Andrea said and ask, if the two co-chairs have recommendations in terms of how we address these discrepancies and how moving forward, whether it's through the report or other mechanisms, get more accurate data and also get accountability. I'm especially distressed that the Attorney General himself and that the office would make any claims about the data being inaccurate when it is through the Department of Justice that we're doing much of this work, and that there are local efforts then to undermine what we all gather here to do on a regular basis.
Manju, I can just speak to the co-chairs. We haven't discussed it at all for any specific recommendations. I think it would be worth folding this in either to the accountability subcommittee, maybe to come up with something, or the stop data subcommittee, and maybe get some feedback from DOJ as to what actions they could take that could be on the table for us to recommend. But I personally think this should be a more substantial part of the report highlighting these issues. I don't want to undermine the data itself because, again, I think there's so much of this happening, so much of these incidents occurring that I think the trends are accurate. I think when you look at the statewide compilation of everything, we are getting the right, identifying the right kind of what's going on, the nuances. But I think there's a lot that's missing in the current state. So I'm happy to discuss moving it into a subcommittee for further discussion. Lily, Steve, did you want to say something to this and then?
Or maybe Lily go first and I'll.
Well, I was just going to say, yeah, it seems to me that there are two, coming from the Stop Data Subcommittee, two main prongs now. One is, the data does shine a light on police practice and law enforcement practice, and it's pointing to issues and challenges, and it's pointing to policy recommendations and change that can be affected. And so, Melanie, you said this yourself. You said there are trends. The data is still telling us something. But then secondarily, are we getting as accurate a picture as we could? And also, there's serious, if there are issues with compliance and the integrity of data, that is its own issue. So I just want to be clear, and I know, Melanie, you weren't suggesting, it's not that we don't forge ahead with already the tools that we do have at our disposal, but I heard you propose that either through the Stop Data Committee or the accountability, work of an accountability subgroup, or both, that this also, the issue of the data integrity and compliance and so on, also become a larger portion of the report, rather than just it sounds like you're saying, rather than just referring it to, there are concerns raised, for example, through the Inspector General looking in LA, or there are concerns raised from this report, that we do something further. And I would strongly support that. I just want to also, it shouldn't take away from the work that we're already doing. It's our chance to push further. Steve, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I had just some thoughts. This is a relatively new effort, only a few years old. And I think that it will improve as time goes on, as the questionnaire is changed, as things are split, as these internal checks are done. And I think just as the whole enterprise has to strive to kind of look for inconsistency and then figure out how to address it. And it seems to me, if I understand LASD, and our law enforcement members can correct me if I'm wrong, if this is not the process, but when they stop someone after the stop has completed, they all in, and it's cleared with a radio code, and they have these three codes that they use, 840, 841, 842. I remember what the other one is. And in clearing that, if it's a traffic stop, they also report information about who was stopped, what the outcome was, and they actually have an entire separate form at the LA Sheriff Department that they use. And it seems if that's what's happening, and then RIPA is filled out, a separate system, and the reports seem to suggest that their CAD system is antiquated and dependent on a single consultant, and it can't speak to the two. But at a minimum, we have a base of every stop that is then cleared into dispatch at the end of the stop. So when we know presumably what the universe of stops are, unless officers are not clearing them at the end. And so we have a benchmark, and that's what the LA Inspector General did. So it seemed, if that's the way other departments work too, that CAD data could be used to say these are the stops, and perhaps come up with a set of business rules to code the stops from CAD that are supposed to be reported to RIPA. Then you have a benchmark against which to compare at least the count of RIPA stops, see how close they are. And maybe that's kind of the direction to go in, to identify the departments where things line up perfectly or are close, and the departments where that's not the case, and then try to dig in why it's not the case. And I'm just trying to think of ways we can push forward so that the quality improves with time. And then it might be a technical issue. It could be if CAD can automatically populate the beginning of the RIPA entry and then the rest is filled in by the officer. Maybe there's ways to do that. I don't know. But I do think some creative thinking along this lines that's probably IT based to some degree. And then also, just making sure systems are talking to one another and looking for those inconsistencies, maybe asking that of the departments. Can you produce the total number of stops from your CAD? And then that could be part of the data quality checks moving forward.
This is Commissioner Hillman. I'm not sure of the process. Ours is different, so I'm not sure how they process theirs as opposed to CHP. And as we know, I think we probably have the most stops in any agency. So I too would say, I would encourage the ride along so that maybe understanding the process is better. And then I also would say, like you just said, I think analyzing the data and seeing where that inconsistency is, and then going back to the CAD if that's the case, and seeing if maybe we can reconcile it that way, because it versus leaning towards that someone is voluntarily trying not to, maybe there is an issue that can account for it, and we can reconcile that maybe with the, as I remember Ochoa said, to get a group together that can look at where is this occurring, and let's address that first and see where we go from there. Because I can tell you, is as one of the largest state agency, this was a very heavy lift for our department to get up to speed. And our people really have done a fantastic job of making sure that we could be in compliance. But it's definitely a very heavy lift, especially for those agencies coming on board. So really, I think it would be very well. I like what you're saying about, looking at some agencies that, are doing it right. How is that happening? And maybe sharing those best practices with other agencies. We're always, willing to be able to help out wherever.
Tamani?
I guess one of my main concerns, sorry, my dog is barking in the back. One of my concerns is that when we were having one of the presentations, they said now we're going to have all these new agencies come in and they're going to be reporting information. And my fear is that if it's inaccurate, is it going to change the trend that we're seeing? You know what I mean? If there's failure to report things that need to be reported, and now there's all these additional agencies, are we going to have some huge change in the data, or have we already done that analysis and the trends are still the same? I'm just not sure where in the process of collecting data from the new agencies we are. Was that last year? Was that last year's report, and the trends are still the same? I'm trying to come up to speed because it's my first year here, so.
I understand you're asking if the new agencies coming online are going to be in this upcoming report. Is that what you're asking?
Were they in last year's report already, or is their reporting going to come to be in this year's report?
It will not be in this year's the agencies that came online, the bulk that were reported at the outset of the meeting are not going to be in the report that we are issuing on January 2023.
Okay, so my concern is, with this needing to come up to speed, this is what happens is we pass legislation and then we don't pass a process, and then everybody's trying to create their own process, and everybody has different resources. Some have more, some have less. Is that when you're onboarding that many agencies at one time, what might that do to the data, and might it shift things in a way that we get some kind of weird, once we get that information, we get some kind of opposite result because the data is there's mistakes being made, or there's things not being data not being entered. And so the question is, if the only way to address that is to address it now with requesting that there be some sort of consequence for not reporting. Because what you don't want to get is a report that is so different, looks so different from the last 4 or 5, because then it's not the reliability and legitimacy of this advisory board then comes into question, I think. And like you said, the data comes into question, and like the racial justice stack, you can't use it because it's the data's moving all over the place depending on the year and depending on who's reporting and who's complying and who's not.
Ayub?
Thank you, Chair Ochoa. I have a few thoughts on this I wanted to share with the board. One relates to, and I think this is a very important area, and we all recognize that, but maybe a word of caution related to looking at the data just on face value. I could tell you that with my agency, the Sheriff's Office, we run a courthouse as well as a large jail system. And if you looked at arrests by my agency, you would see far fewer RIPA entries for arrests than for arrests that actually occur. Court-ordered remands, warrants that appear for people that are already in custody incidents that result in arrests being made. Those are all incidents that would not trigger RIPA reporting. There's also, in trying to marry up CAD data with RIPA reporting as well, one, the data collection is anonymized, and we know that because we've talked about that many times at most meetings. But when agencies differ on how they collect data through CAD, but sometimes an officer or deputy will make a stop in CAD, which it does not trigger RIPA reporting. For example, if I stop and check on a stranded motorist, it would show as a stop in the CAD system, but it's not a detention, it's not an arrest, there's no search conducted, no RIPA report is required. So it's a very tricky area to try and marry up real data that's collected through CAD, that's collected through police reports being filed with RIPA reporting. There was a mention about the LA County Sheriff talking about the difficulty in doing audits. There are means to audit the information, but it is tricky for those reasons and because of that anonymized component to the RIPA data collection.
Thank you. Are there any other board members that wanted to raise issues on this?
This is Board Member LaWanda again, and I'd just like to thank Sheriff Williams for explaining that. And now that you explained it, I understand it, because I do know of other incidents that they would be stopped and something would not be reported. Yeah, and it's not because something went wrong, it's just the way, just based on the stop. Just for instance, earlier this morning, I seen the officer on TV stop a elderly lady to take her to the beauty salon. That wouldn't have been reported. Yeah. So yeah, I know. Yeah, I know situations.
Sheriff Ayub, can I ask you a question? Is it technically feasible that CAD could be used to sort of flag RIPA stops and then populate sort of the beginning of a report and, both identify this, identify the set of stops that should be included in RIPA and then also start the report for the officer and potentially save time. And then, of course, any sort of identifying information can be stripped from the report before transmitted and anonymized, right, or de-identified, or however it's transmitted. But I wonder if there's a way to have them talk to one another in the sense that based on the state law, stops that are not RIPA stops can be identified, and then the set of, okay, these are the ones you have to do a report on, identified for the officer in the field. And I just think this is as a professor, I have class 150 students. At the end of the semester, there's a list of 150 names. I have to have a grade for each one, right? And I don't have to keep track of who drops, who doesn't. The list is there for me, and then that's my make sure that I've done my work, right? But if I had to keep track of who added, who left, it's going to result in a discrepancy, and that's what used to happen before that. We had those sort of more sophisticated ways that we could report.
Conceivably, they're assuming CAD is a component of the stop. It's not always the case. Sometimes there's specialized units, detectives and so forth, that are operating outside of the computer-aided dispatch system. But from purely a patrol perspective, where CAD is usually used, if it's not down for some reason or another, the officer or deputy could code the disposition of a stop in such a way to indicate that, this is a RIPA incident or it's not. We did something similar with a mental health component. We were trying to look at the number of people with mental illness that we were coming into contact with. And while we don't normally capture that information, we coded the disposition of the stop in such a way that allowed us to quantify the number of times we encountered somebody with mental illness. The same could be done with RIPA, but again, it's self-reporting, and there's a human component there as well. Some stops too could trigger multiple RIPA reports. You have a vehicle with several people inside that are searched or detained in such a way that a RIPA report would be required to be submitted on each individual. So conceptually, you would think, if we have 100,000 stops, there should be more RIPA reports than that submitted, but it's not always the case, as we already talked about.
Can I just add a comment? Thank you. I mean, I think it's clear that this is going to be a multi-faceted issue, and even smoothing the technical path of collecting data, there's still the fact that to the extent that missing data or misreported data, that there's a bias present in that too, indicates that there are other layers to the issue. So all of this, as the discussion expands, it's clear this merits more attention from the board. And so I don't know if formally this needs to be tasked to the accountability group, to the stop data group, if this is suggestions of subcommittees to work on this, but I would love to see us pursue it further. But again, in parallel with still forging forward with the light that we do have that's shining on what's happening on the ground, and maybe swinging back to Board Member Taylor's concern, there will be many more agencies added in each wave of data collection, but because those are the smaller agencies, and just given our perspective of law enforcement, it's unlikely that will somehow undo trends and the bias that we do see and want to address. So there's still a lot of incentive to move forward with the information that we also have at hand.
So maybe to Board Member Kajavi's point about the multifaceted aspect of this, I think That's very true. For those who didn't look at the report, for LASD, the Inspector General flagged this data problem for them in 2018, and they've done nothing about it since. And they also made false statements to the Department of Justice regarding their audits. So it's one thing to have technical difficulty doing it, but they're not admitting that to the Department of Justice. They said that they had completed it. So it's both the technical capability, but also the agency's willingness to, engage and take advantage of those technological advances. And then, as the LAPD data showed, simply not tracking actions or stops anywhere, so that there's not a second data set to refer to make sure that it's happening. To Mani's point about the agencies coming online, perhaps one of the things we can ask the DOJ to provide some information on in terms of steps that it can take is what it can do for like affirmatively monitoring some of those agencies or auditing or something where there's not already documented evidence of non-compliance, to get a sense of, to her point of how are these trends going to be the same as the ones that we've seen or not? Because a lot of these smaller agencies won't have things like an Inspector General's office who take the first pass at kind of being able to flag some of these issues being wrong. Maybe I am not the co-chair of either of these committees, but maybe since this seems like it is a little bit more of an accountability question, the Policies and Accountability Subcommittee be willing to take ownership of this, or if not, we can see if the Customer Service would. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right. And so I mentioned it in my report back because we already have it on our radar in the policy committee. So I think that's an appropriate place to work with it. I mean, I think the Stop Data Committee can look at issues of streamlining data processing collection and identify like glitches around the actual data processing. But I think the Accountability Committee needs to take a look at the compliance issues, because while we recognize that that most law enforcement officers are trying to do the right thing, we have to acknowledge that that might not always be the case. What is our mechanism for accountability when that's not the case? And what are the pathways to seek it? And just to remind ourselves that the reason why accountability matters is that it's a cornerstone of trust. And if we don't have trust of law enforcement, then we don't have public safety, right?
Thank you, Andrea. And maybe just to flag that accountability, we should be considering that at the agency level too, because I think some of these problems arise from the agency, what has the agency provided for? And I think, Steve, does that sound like a good split? I think you're the chair, one of the co-chairs for Calls for Service, to take on that other part.
Lily and I are co-chairs for Stop Data Analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Okay, great. Are there any more comments on this issue? I know that took us quite some time, but I think it was a very important issue. Go ahead, Lily.
I had one question. You pointed out in framing the issue not only the concerns, but also the ways in which reports like this can be used. And you referred to, for example, in litigation or court cases, just if information in the report is used as some kind of benchmark or measure, and so I'm wondering if also, as we're thinking about the report itself, not just our future actions and recommendations, but if including in analysis of stop data, that there should be some framing or, again, something more than just referring in passing to some of these audits. And so given your background expertise, you may have some guidance for either the report or the Stop Data Committee. I don't want us to lose that strand as well as an ingredient to the report. So just a footnote comment, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. We definitely should engage in how we frame it in the report as well. Think about how we should interpret the rest of the data. You're right. Any other final comments? Okay, the last one is the This is unfortunately going to be, well, not unfortunately, this is another long, unfortunate for our agenda timeline, possibly longer analysis. I wanted to, I'll go over kind of where we are, and then I had a kind of request to flag for the full committee. So one of the ongoing issues is the Museum of Tolerance Racial Identity Profiling Train the Trainer curriculum. The last meeting we flagged that RIPA board members who attended the meetings expressed concerns that POST and MOT painted this as a minor update when it had not been updated in 20 years and had the wrong standard of law, and there were numerous other issues that we identified as being potentially harmful in the existing training material. Our suggestion, in addition to substantive suggestions, was to take more time so that this could be a more significant overhaul. But there's an internal deadline of October for finalization and December for rollout, which we believe POST is sticking to. The board members have not yet seen the substance of any updated material, although there's another session with POST MOT coming up soon, so we may see something then, but it's unclear what exactly our impact is going to be on the substance of the training at this point. Hopefully we'll have more to report back on in the next meeting, more positive report back. There are two regulations that we engage with POST on. I'll just give a brief update on both. There's AB 846, which is the regulations relating to screening for implicit and explicit bias. We worked with POST to make amendments on those regulations that we thought addressed the issues we previously raised, and they're being finalized and should have been voted on at their May 25th meeting to finalize. And then SB2, we worked with them. That's the Peace Officer Decertification process. We submitted, if you recall, in our last full board meeting, we submitted a letter lodging comments on SB2's regulation around the definition of racial bias. The letter the full board submitted was filed in advance of the regulations being published and were resubmitted during the formal comment period. And I'm not sure if there's any other way that we plan on engaging on that, but that might be kind of the end of our engagement at this point. Two pieces of legislative update. Well, I'll skip that actually. One other update just in terms of our work going into the report is that we'll be conducting a partial review of Learning Domain 42, which focuses on prejudice, discrimination, and profiling. We're going to take a deep look at the overview for that course and expect to have comments to incorporate into the report similar to our past review of Learning Domain 3. And then the last piece is the legislative update. If you recall, there was a bill, AB 2285, to remove calls for service from the RIPA data so that agencies would no longer have to collect data on stops arising out of a call for service. We submitted a letter in opposition on that, and the bill did not go forward. And I was told that the RIPA input mattered a lot to the decision to kill that bill in the Assembly Public Safety Committee. So just so you know, they took our advice on that, or took it under submission. And so the last substantive thing is another bill that I would like to see us weigh in on. This is a bill that would require POST to create a uniform definition of bias that will be used for all officer discipline. The bill number is AB 2457, and I believe the full text was provided in the materials. This was not discussed in the subcommittee because the bill didn't exist at that time. It was a late session gut and amend, which is basically, for those not engaging in legislative advocacy, just taking an existing bill, changing it all to be a different bill to kind of get further along in the process. The bill responds to a recent legislative audit that found instances of bias by officers, including hateful speech against various identity groups, that went undisciplined, and agencies, including LASD, claimed that it didn't discipline officers who it found engaged in such bias activity because there was not a definitive statement of what conduct satisfies the meaning of bias. The bill directs POST to create, the bill affirmatively is responding to the recommendations in that audit, and it directs POST to create a definition of bias and identifies a few elements that definition must include, but it's not limited to those elements. So it's creating a single definition that is the basis for discipline. This is consistent actually with a recommendation that we made in our past reports, that there be a consistent definition of biased conduct so that agencies' actions can be compared and understood and make sure that everyone is adhering to the same standards. So that's consistent with our prior recommendation. The law would, on its face, it seems to limit both require and limit agencies to discipline that is within that definition. So if it's outside of the definition of bias that POST comes up with, it's not going to be the subject of discipline by the agency under that heading. So there's the bill on its face seems great. It already responds to a need identified by the audit. It responds to a need identified in our past reports. The only concern on my end that I see is that while there's still a post-regulatory process in terms of how they will make that definition, among the elements that it must include is not included the definition of profiling under RIPA. So hypothetically, if the final definition did not include that RIPA, so profiling, racial identity profiling, arguably agencies would not have to discipline if they violate that law. I think it's reasonable to assume that POST will include that in the definition, but there's just no guarantee. And I think it would be useful for us to submit a letter report suggesting we would support the bill if amended to include the requirement that it include that definition as well as whatever else POST comes up with. It's up for the last committee hearing in a few days, and so that's the last opportunity to amend it, really. And it's even possible that any amendments are already final because it's so close to that deadline, but I think it's worth chiming in. And there's a draft letter reflecting that concerns and saying, making that recommendation. If folks agree with the underlying issue, we could edit that letter and then vote on sending it out. So I'm happy to answer any questions on that, but essentially the gist of it is making sure that any definition of biased conduct necessarily includes the definition of racial identity profiling as already defined in the Act.
I strongly endorse our moving forward this, and in short, the letter is, it's consistent with our work as a board, and it's consistent with the Act.
Would it be appropriate to make a motion at this time?
I believe, and DOJ can correct me, that we can make a motion, second the motion, but we have to vote after public comment, if that's accurate.
It's not a requirement, but that's been the board's been trying to do that practice just to allow public comment.
So then I think, yes, Manju, we can make the motion now.
So I'd like to make the motion to submit the letter as drafted by Co-Chair Achoya, suggest or indicating support, if amended, of AB 2547.
Is there a second?
Board Member LaWanda, I second it.
Okay, great. And if there's any other comments or questions on this, we can hold the vote until after public comment. Unless, DOJ folks, is there a concern that we might not have quorum at any time? Are we close to losing that? If so, maybe we should just vote now.
We do still have a quorum right now. If you'd like, another option may be to take public comment just as it relates to this letter to ensure that we don't lose quorum before taking a vote, since we are, I think, just at quorum right now. So perhaps that's one way around it, is to see if there's any public comment just related to this letter and then reserve the rest of public comment until after the discussion of the report.
Okay, thank you. That's a good idea. So I'll see if there's any members of the public who have a comment specifically on this. I know we've covered a lot of stuff already, but if you have comments on other things, you can raise those at the broader public comment period. So is there anyone that wants to comment on this? I can't see folks, so please you can just jump in. Okay. Hearing none, no public comments, then let's go ahead and vote. So all in favor of submitting the letter as drafted and attached, reflecting support if amended?
Melanie, I can do a roll. I can do a roll call because we have to go back to the roll call method since we're all virtual again.
Okay.
Member Vieira. Ronnie, I see you're still there.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm still here.
How do you vote? Yes, support, or no, not support?
Support.
Thank you. Member Ray?
I support it.
Member Randolph?
Do not support. Oppose.
Member Kajabi?
In favor, support.
Member Guerrero? Is that a yes, Member Guerrero? I didn't hear you.
Sorry, my internet's faulty. Support.
Yes, thank you. Member Kennedy?
Yes, support.
Member Ayub?
Yes.
Member Taylor?
Yes, I support.
Member Hawkins?
Support.
Member Ochoa?
Support.
Member Raphael? Steve, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Was that a yes? Okay. And I think that was everyone that was on the line. Did I miss any board members?
Yes, this is Manju Kulkarni. I
Sorry.
support. That's okay.
I thought I called you already. Sorry, Manju. Thank you. So the motion passes. It's 11-1.
Thank you. And if it's at all possible, can we get that out today? Just because I know the vote is so soon. Want to make sure it has whatever impact it can.
Yeah, we can get that out today. I just wanted to clarify, that's coming from the board co-chairs or the subcommittee co-chairs?
Do you want to do the board co-chairs? Does that make sense, Steve?
Okay. Do we have permission to send it out under your signature?
Yes, you have mine.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you all. And I'm glad that was a good conversation. So we're a little behind schedule, but can we jump into the discussion of the 2023 report? I don't know if the DOJ wanted to say anything about the report at the outset or just open it up for board member comments.
So we'll just open it up for comments, please. We just gave we gave the broad strokes at the beginning, so we're happy to see the time for a board discussion.
Great, thank you. So I'll open it up. Are there any board members that would like to comment on the report so far? Andrea, go ahead.
Yeah, so we had a chance to dig in on the policy section of the report in our policy committee, and we'll be holding 2 additional policy committee meetings as the report drafts develop. I just wanted to say to the DOJ staff, I appreciate all the work and the effort. I know this is a lot, and this is crunch time for you guys. We hope to give you the feedback you need going forward. So just thank you.
Is there a board member that was trying to jump in? I have a couple comments for the report. There are some minor comments I have. I can send you them because I wrote them down, and we don't need to go through them in the meeting. Kind of the bigger ones that I had were on page 21 and 28. There are 2 different tables on actions taken during stop by age group. The first one indicates that young people are the most likely to have actions taken, and then the second one suggests that they're the least, they have no action, or more likely to have no action taken. So those 2 didn't seem reconcilable to me, and if there's a difference in what they're displaying, I wasn't able to capture it. So either if there's an error there, or just the description could be clarified so that's more clear what the difference is between those 2. Pages 37 to 40 are the use of force analysis. As evidenced by the conversation earlier, I have overall concerns about the accuracy of the use of force analysis, particularly since that's a very overall small N, and the issues with non-agency reporting. I'm curious, we don't have to engage this now, but if the descriptives for that seemed plausible on their face. I know when looking at 2019 data for 4 different agencies, 2 of the agencies had basically no use of force whatsoever, didn't point their gun, didn't use taser, didn't use pepper spray, didn't use impact weapon, didn't use canine. So that, and these are some of the biggest agencies. They also didn't report any deaths when they had, I think, collectively 17 that had been not reported between those 3 agencies. So I'm just curious if whether reported 155 shootings for the largest 58 agencies. And I don't know if that's plausible or not, considering there were more stops this year, and there were 313 the last year, although that includes all agencies statewide, not just the largest ones. So just want to scoop that analysis into kind of what we look at when we're talking about the data accuracy and making sure that we are either caveating it correctly or problematizing it. Page 41, that's the introduction of pretext stops, and there's a discussion of REN here, which I think correctly describes REN and gives the problems arising out of REN. But I think, to me, the next step of that discussion should be to introduce RIPA and its requirements, which impose a higher standard, which is defining illegal profiling as consideration of or reliance on to any degree in deciding which persons to subject to a stop, which I think directly engages with REN and what that means. So I appreciated that discussion, but I do think there should be some discussion of the RIPA Act and how that affects it, particularly as we go into kind of, I think some of the policy recommendations for pretext stops would be even stronger if we understand that it's actually trying to help make the law, like, enforce the law that California already passed. Page 68, there's the youth discussion. And I just thought that would be useful just to incorporate maybe at the outset of that, even though that's not the data reporting section, some of the RIPA data itself on the treatment of youth, showing them more likely to be stopped, more likely to ask for consent search. And I think that really feeds into the problem that's being discussed there and kind of how these issues that have arisen contribute to the current state of what students are experiencing in policing, or young people are experiencing through policing. Page 88, there's a complaint timeline, and there's a recommendation that complainants be notified of the disposition, but no discussion of what the substance of that notification should be. I think currently complainants only get notified that the complaint has been disposed of, not how, like whether it was founded, unfounded, discipline, no discipline. I think we should advocate for or recommend the greatest amount of disclosure as allowed under the law. And I think at least for incidents that don't implicate personal privacy or are expressly disclosable under law, so like lying, sexual assaults, uses of force, etc., we should be recommending that agencies provide at least the disposition documents, like if there is the final conclusion on the use of force or a use of force review committee or disciplinary determination, and let them know that they can also request more. These are public documents. I think the complainant would be the most interested in receiving those, and they shouldn't have to go through the separate process of PRing their own documents on their own incident. And then the last one on page 98, there's a discussion of the Little Hoover Commission recommendations. And it lists off the recommendations from the Little Hoover Commission, but it's unclear whether the RIPA board is suggesting that it endorses or supports those recommendations. And there were just 2 funding recommendations that I'm not sure that we fully do support, or we want to at least consider them. So I just wanted to at least flag those, either make it clear that we're not actually endorsing this, but just flagging that this body has done this work, or determine whether we want to actually endorse those specific recommendations. And then just lastly, just overall, just the seeking an inclusion of what we talked about in terms of the data accuracy issues. So those are my points, and with some other things, and so I'll just send you this whole list. The DOJ. Are there other folks with comments?
I just want to say that last year's report was very weighty in all senses, and I could see we're headed there this year too. Thank you so much to DOJ. Something that's very significant, I think, last year was that, say, just looking narrowly at the data, that there was not only some analysis, but then recommendations that flowed from that. And I'm very much looking forward to the policy and other recommendations that come out of this report, and especially I appreciate that that's going to be added later, that there also is looking to what some of the impacts were or were not of the report last year. For example, there's a placeholder for legislation enacted in 2022. That may be not just a function of last year's report, but also other relevant legislation. But it's great to see the evolution of this process too, as we move to affect, not just have the reports, of course, but also then see what kind of change they can affect. So thank you to DOJ.
Just say I jumped into my comments, but I should have said at first like how impressive the body of work was here, and particularly the great detail that you had on movement on pretext stops policies. I'm certain that is going to be something that's useful for folks in the upcoming years. So this report is definitely going to get some use on the ground, which I think is important. Are there other comments?
I wanted to express my appreciation as well to the DOJ team for this report draft. And also, can you just remind me what our timeline is? As I know for the Calls for Service subcommittee, we want to make sure to include our comments or take those comments at our next subcommittee meeting. And then, of course, prior to our next general meeting.
So we are in the process of scheduling the next subcommittee meetings, and we hope by those subcommittee meetings to have some additional data depending on when the meetings are being scheduled, and also have drafts that are further in development. And so the hope at the next set of subcommittee meetings is that the subcommittees can review the drafts for those sections, and then if you do wish to make any recommendations, that may be a time to make those recommendations. There's also the possibility of subcommittee meetings after the October 12th board meeting, but the hope is that the report is fairly developed by then, and much further along than it is now. And so there will be an opportunity at the next set of subcommittee meetings for the subcommittees to think about and perhaps vote on recommendations that they can then bring to the board for the October board meeting.
Great, thank you, Allison.
If there's no other, Commissioner Ray? Oh.
Yes, thank you, I think your only thing when I was looking through this report, I had some concerns with regard to some of the charges that were looked at as saying that they don't pose a threat to the public, things such as driving without a license, drug possession, and some of the traffic violations that often are indicators of some more serious driving behavior. So I just want to make sure that that's something that's going to be warranted. If we're going to have further discussion, or is this something, moving forward, that is something that is, is there further discussion? Basically, that I just want to be able to make sure that we're going to be able to engage in that and kind of point out areas of concern with regard to that.
Commissioner Wright, Commissioner Wright, is there a page that you're referring to in the report?
Yes, I came at page 64 just now that was concerning. So I think it's 64 is number 1. And then also, let me see here. And then also on page 61, in section D, where it's, some of the traffic safety programs with unarmed civilians. I mean, those are just things as law enforcement that I have some concerns with. I don't want people hurt. And I want to make sure that we're saying, what crimes are we talking about? What does that look like versus just a broad stroke? I think that's something we'd have to get more in the weeds. What would that look like? And are we going to get more information on what kind of proposals that we're talking about with regard to having unarmed civilians out there, trying to deal with traffic and enforcement matters?
And someone from the DOJ can correct me if this is wrong. I read on page 64 the identification in this particular context as identifying the things in the models that have been discussed here as the things that they have used. And I think that mirrors what they have used, not necessarily saying that those are the ones that we have determined, but whether or not it wants to follow the existing models. Is that intended to be what that statement is saying, or is it saying something else? Maybe someone from the DOJ can clarify.
Hey, this is Kendall. Thank you so much for raising the question. So part of the reason we presented so many different policies, both law enforcement policies, state legislators' policies, as well as district attorney policies, is to really present those all to the board of ways different agencies are approaching eliminating pretextual stops and considerations for reaching recommendations this year. The board, of course, as you know, last year recommended taking steps to end pretextual stops, which is very similar to what the executive order from President Biden also explained. And so we're trying to put together some of that information for the board to make decisions on what policy recommendations they think would be appropriate, given the data we're going to be able to review this year, hopefully soon, but then also kind of pairing this with kind of the array, if you will, of different policies that are being developed throughout the country. So I hope that answers your question.
Well, it does, but I just was wondering, is that going to include more broader discussion on what type of pretextual stops we're talking about? Not just, just what different agencies, is going to be some particular stops, is it no licenses? So are we saying if you're driving without a license, is that something that we don't want to address? Or is it something, so I think I just would like to see some more specific data on where DOJ is going with it versus just models from other agencies.
I think just to answer that particular question, Commissioner Ray, I think the policy subcommittee and the Stop Data subcommittee will be able to look at these sections and have a discussion about the data and any concerns in terms of how it's being categorized in terms of the data and the way the RIPA board is categorizing the data. Otherwise, I think the report is reporting back on how other agencies have made these characterizations and just reporting back on those.
Okay, and that's I think that answers my question, because I just want to make sure that also that there could be some other ideas like the CHPs, what our thoughts would be with regard to some of the validity and having some of these things still included. So I'll wait for the further discussion with my group, but thank you.
Yeah, Commissioner, the CHP is a voice in that discussion, given that your main job is traffic enforcement. So we certainly do welcome input from CHP and everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you. No further from me. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And thank you to the DOJ as well for answering those questions. If there is any other board member that wants to comment or ask questions, please jump in. Otherwise, I'll move on to public comment if there's not. Okay, then I will move forward to public comment.
Melanie, sorry, Board Member Shoa, I think you're muted. Were you calling for public comment?
Yes, sorry, I was pulling up some language to help us make sure that we're.
Sorry, I thought I had lost you. Okay, thank you.
No, sorry, I should have done that before we got to this point. To make sure that we're being equitable in terms of how we are addressing comments and that we're making sure that we're responding to everyone the same way. So at this time, the public, we're going to open up for public comments to address the RIPA board. We'll try to limit the comments to 2 minutes. I think we're not going to have a question and answer. I know sometimes people ask questions. We're not going to have the board respond to questions, but if there are clarification questions that we may be able to answer, have the DOJ answer at the end, we'll try to take note of those so that they can be addressed either by dropping information in the chat box or by addressing them at the end if it's a clarification. So you can raise your hand in the BlueJeans app or unmute yourself if you're on the telephone. And I can try to, how about I go to the telephone first, if there's anyone who is just on the telephone that would like to give a comment. Okay, hearing no one. I see Mr. Davis has a hand raised. Go ahead and proceed.
Yes, so as far as collecting data for the RIPA data, if you will, will there be technology used such as like automation to collect data in real time?
Again, I think if we have some questions that we can answer, we might do so at the end, but if you have other aspects of your comment, go ahead and give them.
That was just one of my major questions that I wanted to ask. That's it.
I thank you.
You're welcome.
And is there anyone else who would like to give a public comment?
Well, I did nothing wrong. Why were you trying to, what are you doing now? What are you doing?
Okay, if that's the only comment. I think someone from DOJ could maybe actually respond just to remind folks that the differences in the ways that agencies can collect and report back their data, just so we're a reminder. Maybe Erin?
Sure. And in the future too, I'll have a graphic that we put together that might be handy to kind of depict what we call like the life cycle of the records. I'm sorry, I can't find it right now to pull it up. But the short answer in response to your question is that yes, there, depending on the agency, they may utilize automation to collect and report the stops in real time, but there is a lot of variation from agency to agency. Just in our work with them, I know that there are some officers that are assigned in agency certain details where they may need to come back to the station before they can enter their data because of the type of work that they do in the field. They don't have access to a patrol car or something like that. An agency that comes to my mind mentioned that their motorcycle cops, as an example, might initially capture a pad and then key in the data later. So there is really a large variety of how the data is collected, but there definitely are instances of some agencies that are collecting the data in real time that it would be entered after the stop is completed, and then at that time it directly comes to Department of Justice repository too.
Thank you for that answer. I think if that's the only public comment, I think, I can't tell if there's folks' hands raised that I'm missing. Okay. Then we can just move forward to next steps that are kind of outstanding. I'm not sure that I captured them all, so if there's something from a subcommittee or if DOJ wants to chime in or Steve on the different next steps, please do. One that I heard was, as a relatively smaller follow-up, that if there are suggestions of SMEs, subject matter experts on dispatcher, that they're trying to still solicit those. I think Manju put in the chat, I think even the link to be able to do that. We are going to send out the letter on AB 2457, hopefully today, signed by the co-chairs. We're going to have a follow-up at a later board meeting on ways that we might be able to engage if the Penal Code 148.6, which is I forget what we call it, like discouraging language on the complaint forms, goes forward with additional litigation. We're going to incorporate questions on data integrity in the stop data and accountability subcommittees to potentially build out something more significant for the report and in terms of next steps. Those are all that I had written down. Steve, do you know if I'm missing anything in terms of next steps?
No, I think that's it. And I guess the additional work for stops data and accountability regarding data. That was it.
Yeah. And then just for all the subcommittees, I think we're going to get drafts to try to nail down some of the recommendations to have something more firm to review by the October full board meeting. Is there anything else from the DOJ that is missing?
I think you covered it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any last minute comments from any board members? Good. Okay. Wow, I can't believe we went under time based on how that was going at the outset. Okay, well, great. Thank you for everyone who gave presentations today. They were amazing and helpful. Thank you to the DOJ who put together this already very thorough report, and we're looking forward to seeing how it continues to evolve over the next couple meetings. And thank you for the board members for providing your time and the public for sticking with us through this meeting, some of whom provided comments also in advance of the meeting as well. So thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.